So for today, I actually have a guest on my channel who's going to be doing the vast majority of the talking. I've got recovering Catholic here. A friend of mine actually sent me your story that you posted on Mr. Atheist's Reddit recently, talking about the Steubenville Youth Conference. Could you tell us a thing or two about that?
Yes. So it's a youth conference that takes place every summer for Catholic teens. And I was 12 when I went there. Normally they want people in between the ages of 13 to 18, which is about the time that most kids are starting high school and then finishing high school. I, however, was younger than most of the kids in my grades. So since I still showed enough maturity, they allowed me to go when I was 12. And so a lot of this I'm going to be kind of reading off just so that way I get the timeline all in order. But this, so like I said, I was 12 years old, and I was very excited to go on this trip because my brother had gone on the trip when he was younger and he had absolutely loved it. It sounded like a big party, but it would be super wholesome without drugs or alcohol, which in my town, unfortunately, kids my age were already getting into. When planning the trip for months and months in advance, my family had thought we would be having the nuns from our Catholic church there. However, they left the church a month prior to the trip. Due to just like reorganization stuff. They were told they had to go to another parish. So in their stead, there was this group of volunteer adults who were like, okay, we'll take over the youth group and we'll take over taking these kids on this trip. And the youth group for my particular church was a branch of the Life Teen organization. Now, if you haven't been to the Steubenville conference, the first night is like a massive party with Christian rock bands. Lights flashing, smoke, sweaty teens who have no clues what deodorant or showers are, but still good, clean fun, appropriate for Catholic teens. And it was a great time until suddenly I couldn't breathe. I'm gasping for air, but nothing is coming in. I'm getting lightheaded from a lack of oxygen. And there was a 14-year-old guy who I'll call D. He gets involved later as well. Who was the only sort of buddy that I had there, because again, I was younger than most people. And he quickly got an adult, brought her over to me, and this woman brings me to the basement of the building where there is a first aid room. The dude in the first aid room thinks I'm just dehydrated, but assured me that if I'm not better in 3 hours, they'll send me to an ER. 3 hours. I'm having trouble breathing. Usually one would think that'd be something to take immediately, but apparently not.
Yeah. Out of quick curiosity, are you asthmatic?
Yes, I am, but we did not know that at the time. Because we knew that I had some muscle issues, but we didn't know that I was asthmatic yet. Okay. And this turned out to be my first asthma attack, as we later found out when I had told my parents about what happened on the trip. Not about the stuff that they did, just about the medical event that happened. And they took me to the doctor who tested everything, and he was like, oh, it seems that you had an asthma attack. And so they got me on an inhaler and everything, and I still have pretty bad asthma, but not nearly as quick as it was back then, or as long lasting, because inhalers and everything.
All right.
So,
yeah. Sorry for the interruption. I just
No, that's fine. But yeah, very first asthma attack. And I'm alone with all these people I don't really know in Ohio, and I live in New York. So like we had taken a pretty long journey, and now I'm out here in Ohio having what to me is just I can't breathe, but now I know it to be an asthma attack. And this guy who was running sort of the first aid room and the lady who had brought me down really laid on thick that an ER trip could cost my family thousands and thousands of dollars. And I'm a kid. I don't know anything about how money works, except that there's a lot of it and that medical care can be expensive. But I later learned that actually our insurance would have covered it, and that it certainly wouldn't have been in the thousands of dollars even if it didn't. So in my blurred vision, because, lack of oxygen, I could still tell the time on a clock that was in the room as I was turning a corner. And so I tried to hold that time in mind just so I could remember, okay, like in 3 hours, they're going to let me go, like to the ER if this is still happening. So then they lay me on this cot and have me drinking water, but not regular size, like foot tall. I'm talking about like smart water bottles. These things are massive. And, especially to a 12-year-old. And they're forcing me to drink 1 bottle, then 2 bottles, then 3 bottles. And I'm still not getting better. So I'm like, so in my head, I'm like, clearly I'm not dehydrated, but these are adults. Like, I can't really protest. Plus, the way that they were holding the water bottles was actually, let me demonstrate with one I have here. They were holding it up above me as I was laying down, in a way that I couldn't actually, like, stop the flow of water. And so I just had to keep drinking. But, trying to drink all of that water at once really wasn't helping me breathe. So then every so often, the adults from my group, the ones who had volunteered to lead all of us, keep coming down to check on me and rotating with the lady who had originally brought me down. So that way everyone can get to check in on me. I'm not technically being left alone with just a random guy, and they can still enjoy the party upstairs. But about 2.5 hours into this, I'm guessing just because I couldn't see the clock from the cot, all of the adults come in. And they just sort of like line up circling the cot. And they brought down with them a priest. Now, this wasn't our priest, because our priest didn't go on this trip. He had stayed back in New York. And so they just grabbed a random priest who had come to the event. And so they're all circling the cot. And they all start holding hands while surrounding me. 1 or 2 of them pulled out a rosary. And the original lady who had brought me down is still holding the water bottle to my mouth, while her wrist that's holding the water bottle is grasped by somebody next to her, and she's holding hands with someone else. So again, can't really interrupt her with the water flow, and I'm still too weak to even like push it away. And then the priest pulls out a bucket of holy water and this metal device that Catholics are probably familiar with, that they use to spritz holy water onto the crowd at church, but he was just spritzing it on me. And as he's doing this, he starts reciting a long prayer, and the adults are repeating it and adding in their own stuff, and they just keep spritzing me with the holy water and clutching their rosaries, feeding me the water like I'm a gerbil. And it took them several minutes of this to realize that, if anything, I'm choking on the water. And so they just sort of awkwardly get up and leave. And now that I no longer have the gerbil water, I'm starting to be able to breathe on my own again, gaining a little bit of strength. But obviously I'm still fairly weakened by all of this. And once I can sit up and stand up without falling back down, they just escort the one adult who happened to be there at the time, escorted me back upstairs and then outside because the whole party thing that was going on ended. And when I glanced at the clock on my way out, I found out that it had been 4 hours since I had been brought down. 4. Like not 3.5, like, oh, you just happened to be getting better. No, it was 4 hours. And they were like, oh, well, I guess you're better now. And just let it go at that. So, and now instead of handing me to more adults, the adult who had led me back upstairs and outside brings me over to 2 of the teen girls that I'm staying with, and that I'm going to be rooming with for this weekend. And the girls realize that I have just been through a lot, and that I had not eaten then since 6 in the morning, and by now it was about 11:30 at night. I never got the chance to go back to our room and get money, so I didn't even have any money to buy food that was available that late. And the room would be locked for a while still, because the organizers had it so that boys and girls, as the church defines them, would be staying in separate buildings. And they then locked the doors to those buildings until certain times, so that way no one could have any heterosexual rendezvous, because, that's how they do. Specifically, we were staying in the college's dorm rooms because this all takes place at Steubenville College. Our group had 7 girls, including myself, on this trip. And we were all crammed into one small dorm room that had 2 twin beds and then cold tiled floor. In planning this trip, my parents had been told that there would be beds and no need for a sleeping bag. So these girls who went and bought me a hot dog with their own money, which was super sweet of them. And then they tried to negotiate with the other girls we were rooming with, so that way I could share half of a bed with one of them. And the 4 older girls, all of whom were even older than these 2, pretty rudely scoffed and said no, because they were seniors, so they had earned the privilege to sleep in a bed. And though they were unsuccessful in securing me a bed, the 2 kinder girls actually gave me their jackets so I didn't have to sleep on just the tiled floor. I'm still Facebook buddies with these guys that were kind to me, love them. And now the next morning, after we've finally been allowed back into the dorms, we go to Mass because it's a Catholic thing. Even if it's a Saturday, even if I just had a medical issue and I did not really get to sleep well, but I was the good Catholic girl, so I didn't fight it. Now I'm finally able to catch up with my friend D, since he hadn't seen me after he had to go and get me help, and he was freaking out the whole time. He couldn't find me, and so I finally tell him what happened, that I am feeling better, and he was relieved. But I didn't mention the prayer circle as I had kind of been calling the event, because, you know, they were praying and they were in a circle. I didn't think anything suspicious. But I didn't really want to think about it anyways because I felt embarrassed by this happening, especially since I was so young. And then as I'm like talking to him about this, the cardinals start coming in to the room where they were having mass. And just as I'm about to, like, you know, shut up and tell Dee to, like, be quiet, he whacked my arm. And I'm like, what was that for? And he indicates that my nose was bleeding all of a sudden, right as the cardinals had started walking in. So again, he grabs the closest adult, which happens to be the same lady from the night before who had brought me down to the first aid room. And she brings me back. I am told to sit on my cot, as I was calling it. And an hour and a half later, my nose finally stops bleeding. I had longer nosebleeds. It didn't seem like a terribly big deal to me. You know, if anything, it's like, oh, well, you know, I can breathe at least. And then she's like, okay, so let's go. We get upstairs again, and the cardinals are leaving the auditorium that they were holding mass in, which had also been where they had held the concert stuff the night before. And the woman turns to me and says, you should go talk to the cardinals. I'm thinking, oh, okay, she means as like an educational thing. But I ask, oh, why? And she says to me, a 12-year-old girl miles and miles from home, because the devil is out to get you. I looked for a smirk or joking tone, and I got nothing. So I book it. I speed walk to this little place that's just outside the building where there didn't seem to be a lot of people because, you know, I'm freaking out. I don't really need an audience of strangers. And I'm like, I need to call home. Like, this freaked me out. So I start by calling my house phone, and nobody answers. I call each of my parents' cell phones. Nobody answers. I called my two best friends' cell phones and their house phones, and I got nothing. Which, at the time, for me, proved that clearly Satan must be out to get me, that this lady was right, and, you know, clearly wanted to block me from, you know, speaking to people who would comfort me. Because after all, I couldn't possibly deserve it if Satan was out to get me. So there I am, 12 years old, several miles from home, no friends, and undiagnosed anxiety, believing that the actual devil was out to get me. And like any good Catholic girl, I went to the one person who'd been kind to me, Dee, and didn't say a thing about it. We carried on with the day until we were told to gather in the auditorium again for the Saturday evening event known as Adoration. Now, Adoration is allegedly when the Holy Spirit was called down to embrace all of us gathered before them. We were told the various signs of people being taken over by the Spirit, like hysterical laughing, weeping, speaking in tongues, which according to them is ancient Babylonian, and it just sounds like gibberish. And that there were other people who were able to understand the tongues, and people fainting. So people start dropping like flies around me, like just falling out of their chairs, and like they said, there was suddenly weeping and, you know, crying out, and it was very dramatic, especially in the dark, because most of the auditorium was dark. There was just like a couple stage lights on. And two women who were leaders from my group just so happened to be a pair of a speaker and a translator. And wouldn't you know it, the Holy Spirit told them to grab my shoulders from behind me and start babbling in my ears, like going, like absolute nonsense. And then the lady who was interpreting said it was to help with the whole Satan thing I got going on. And at the time, I was at least pretty sure this was bullshit. Like, at least the part about them being able to speak in tongues and understand it. But I thought that they just wanted to pray for the kid who clearly is evil and, devil wants her. And I thought, okay, they're just using this time as an excuse to be able to do that.
I actually want to interrupt you again real quick.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. But, I mean, first of all, I thought it was like basically just the Pentecostals that spoke in tongues. I never experienced Catholics doing that. And
Oh, yeah.
I was very Catholic for quite some time. But, I mean, okay, so during adoration, people were weeping, laughing hysterically, evidently speaking in tongues, which is just them babbling, to be honest. So it's already a very emotionally charged situation. You are a 12-year-old child at this point who is hundreds of miles away from home. And there's like apparent, like D is the only person that you really know very well there.
Yeah. Like he's the only one.
So only one person that you actually know.
Yeah.
That just sounds like almost a powder keg that's just going to cause a preteen's brain to implode.
Oh yeah. It was like I remember when I had like finished trying to call everyone and I just kept getting no answer, no answer, no answer. I just burst into tears. Like this is it. Like because 12-year-olds already have like they're on the cusp of puberty. They've got a whole bunch of hormones going on. They're stressed. They're insecure. And then I'm being told, devil's out to get you.
Yeah.
Like that was the last thing a 12-year-old needs to hear, especially when they're far away from anyone with a semblance of sanity. And
it just seems to me like one act of gross negligence involving a minor after the next with this story.
It was just bad. Like, and some of these adults were parents. Like so they should know how to take care of a kid. And they mostly kind of almost had the, oh, you're okay, soothing part down. Beyond that, nothing. Like, just, oh my goodness. It was a mess. And oh God.
I actually kind of have another curiosity about the previous night, now that you bring up that some of these people were parents. Did any of these parents come in when you were having trouble breathing to the basement, which is a profoundly stupid place to take someone to breathe?
Yeah.
Were any of them parents?
Yes. The woman who was like the leader of the leaders, she was a mother, and her daughter was actually one of the ones who refused to give me any space on a bed. She was a junior who was friends with the senior girls. And she yeah, she was, I think, a junior. And like, but she got to have half of one bed. And like, even she was just like, whatever. Like, we get the bed. We're older. We've earned it. Like, you're little. You'll live.
See, the part I'm having the most trouble figuring out is how did none of these parents insist that you go to the hospital? I mean, that's
I don't even know.
That's almost definitely what they would do for their own child. So why not extend that same thing to you? That sounds like a pretty big failing on their part.
It was like they also, to give a little more context, there was also one adult out of this group actually, who was a man, and he had years prior to this been helping out with the like elementary to younger age kids, where during the mass they would take those younger kids downstairs, have a more PG rated version of certain Bible stories, and then bring them back upstairs. But during one of these, he actually told the kids there that if they were the product of a like someone's second marriage, if their first marriage ended in divorce or something other than a natural death, that they would never be whole people. And I happen to be a product of a second marriage. But he told all of us that if you were the product of a second marriage or if you were adopted, you were not really a child in the eyes of God. So of course then these people had the genius idea to allow him to be in charge of teenagers instead.
That's just grand.
It's great. Like, totally logical.
Hell.
Oh my goodness. And now, granted, a lot of these people, their kids were now adults. And I don't know if that just means they forgot how children worked, but they kind of were like, they just completely neglected that aspect that we were defenseless children. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. It was just like, you would not have tolerated this if it was your child. But because I wasn't, it didn't matter to them.
That's fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry about interrupting again.
No, it's okay. Please. It's quite a story. There's bound to be questions. So yeah. So in the adoration, you know, there's all of these people fainting, and I actually connected with somebody in 2018 who went to my college, and we had become friends on Facebook. We started talking, and she said she had also gone to this conference, and she knew for a fact that the fainters were faking it because she had been one of them when she had still been an involved Catholic and she had gone to this conference. And, you know, by 2018, I had been out of the church for ages and ages. But I was glad to have that theory proven. So that way, like, if anyone ever tried to say, oh, well, you just don't have faith. No, I have facts. I have facts that there are people who are faking it there to amp up the emotion of the event. So once again, they kept us there for a very late night and then had us get up for Sunday Mass. But the weird events sort of ended there, at least as far as the conference. Because then we headed it back to New York right after the Mass. We just sort of threw all of our things in the bus. Excuse me. And I kept that all bottled up inside for years. which just allowed it to merge with already low self-esteem and anxiety. And it took talking to my best friend several years later about it to realize that it wasn't just a prayer circle. If they were essentially waterboarding me and dousing me with holy water whilst praying over me with rosaries, it's an exorcism. Like there's really no way to justify all of those aspects, especially the refusing to get me actual care.
Yep, gotta jump in again.
No problem.
Okay, so I could be terribly wrong. I haven't
Yeah.
really looked up very much with exorcism, but don't you need the consent of the person being exorcised before you can perform one?
Nope.
No.
Never do.
Outstanding.
It's encouraged, but considering the person who is being exercised upon is not considered to be themselves, they don't actually necessarily need to have the person's consent. If there is somebody who is a guardian of them, which for that time, those youth leaders were considered guardians of me, they would be considered the ones liable to consent to this sort of thing. Well, now, thankfully, the priest did not go into like some sort of rigorous ritualized version of it, but there was still definitely aspects of ritualization to it.
I don't know. I mean, yeah, because you're underage, technically you can't give consent one way or the next. So informed consent would be on legitimate adult figure, preferably an actual caretaker, not you know,
not these strangers.
You know, but I have to point out that it seems kind of negligent to me that they didn't at least tell you that's what was happening.
Oh yeah, like they didn't even tell me they were starting to pray until I started hearing like in our Father's name, and I'm like, what is happening? Like, and they weren't even reciting any of the regular ones. Like, they weren't reciting Our Father who art in heaven. They weren't reciting Hail Marys. It was like this long-winded, like, we pray for this soul to be saved, and like just this really long-winded thing. And it was long enough ago that I wouldn't be able to tell you like if it was entirely in English or not. From what I could understand, it was, but it was just like this drawn out sort of thing. After they had already, again, kept me there for a long time and just kept holding water in my mouth. And then every time that bottle would be empty, they would just put another one back on me. And like, I was too weak from oxygen deprivation to be able to push it away or anything. So just like keep it coming.
It's definitely at the very least negligent, because you've already got a 12-year-old who can't breathe and is freaking out because of that, is basically being drowned.
Yeah.
Because they're just feeding you water constantly, not giving you the opportunity to breathe.
Yeah.
Then you have this group of people that just stand around the cot that you're laying out on.
Yep.
And start. Who wouldn't that freak out?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm a grown-ass man that weighs 240 pounds. That'd freak me out.
Yeah, right? Like even to this day, if they tried to do that sort of thing again, even without that previous experience, it'd be like, what are you doing? Like, I have other medical issues, and if stuff happens and people start surrounding me, it's like, this isn't helping. You're just in the way of professionals and of me having space. Like, it's, oh my goodness. It was just, like, at the time I was able to justify it. Because these are adults, I'm a kid, I don't know anything. And now I'm an adult, and I'm just like, what on earth possessed them to make them think this was okay? Like, just there's nothing that I can think of that would honestly justify it other than their own indoctrination into this.
Yeah.
Like, people, man.
I agree.
Okay, so I think I've got just a bit more written down at least. So we get back, like I said, and I didn't say anything to anyone about this for years. And our priest had no idea any of this was happening. They didn't know any of those events that had happened. He didn't know what Life Teen was doing beyond that, like beyond just that conference to us. And he would have stopped it. But by the time I was willing to talk about any of it, he had already moved to another church. And the priest who took over, he set up the lady's husband as a deacon in the church. As in the lady who said the devil was out to get me. And he had also been at my cot in the circle. So there's no way that I would feel comfortable going to this man and saying, hey, these people, they did these sort of things. Even though at the time I wasn't comfortable to bring that up. I was willing to bring up other things that Life Team did, but clearly if these were people being put in charge, that would not be a good idea because they wouldn't believe me. But for once, a priest is not responsible for somebody's trauma in the Catholic Church, so shout out to him. But Life Teen and the Steubenville Conference are active religious organizations and events which are indoctrinizing and traumatizing Catholic teens. The Catholic priests who've systematically abused children are, of course, a major scandal, but there needs to be attention drawn to these organizations and events like that as well, because they are meant to incite religious fervor, to encourage martyrdom, and to get teens to not only be more active in the church, but to also draw in the younger crowds to, like, get them more involved. They honestly said things that made it seem like you had to be extremely into Catholicism, or else you weren't good enough. When the parents and most of the priests had no idea that these things were happening. To quote Steubenville's site, this summer, over 50,000 Catholic teens across North America will attend one of 25 Steubenville youth conferences to encounter the God who calls us out of darkness into his marvelous light. Lift your eyes to the glory of God. Be restored. These people need to be monitored. Many of the teens in attendance only have church leaders with them, not their parents. There is no one who would cut through the spiritual experience BS and point out the insanity or cruelty of things that can happen there. Like when they refuse to get me proper medical care and the bizarre events of adoration, which to young, vulnerable, tired teens looks extraordinarily real. And I know there's all the jokes and news about Catholic priests, but there are other people who are messing up kids in this religion who slip under the radar. Like, specifically at the conference, I remember people saying around there, if you are not willing to die for your faith, are you truly faithful? Are you truly a good person if you are not willing to die for your faith? And both the conference and the Life Teen organization, Life Teen over many years said this sort of thing to me, but the conference included it as well, that if you are not willing to give of yourself fiscally, like financially, and mentally, emotionally, until you yourself are impoverished, then you are a selfish person. That you are the problem here. And not that we should try and fix any systems, just that we have to, as individuals, give everything to everyone. And that sort of mindset is something that I have to work on with my therapist now. So that way I don't feel awful about everything that I try and do in the efforts of self-care. But yeah, so that's pretty much everything I have written down, at least. But it was a long weekend, and it's been about 10 years, and I still think about it. I still can see them around me, and it took a long time for me to even feel comfortable trying to drink water on my own, because I just remember it being held to my mouth. But yeah.
Okay, so that sounds like a pretty traumatizing weekend. I mean,
Yeah.
you go from having an asthma attack without realizing you have asthma to being effectively drowned by an adult that should honestly know better than to force feed a child who can't breathe water,
Yeah.
to having an exorcism performed on you without being told it's an exorcism, probably causing you to freak out more.
Oh, yeah.
And then being told that you have to sleep on a cold tile floor because a couple of the girls in your room are seniors and they deserve the beds because they're assholes.
Yeah.
You know, all of that on top of the gross negligence that, you know, is almost definitely elsewhere, because you can't have been the only person from that weekend that had a bad weekend.
No.
Um,
I actually found out in the last couple of years, after I had finally told my parents what happened. Somebody asked my parents why I don't go to church. And my mom honestly answered that I had had bad experiences, including a youth conference. And this woman said, "Did she go to the Steubenville conference?" Because there was a young man that she knew who was the son of a friend who had also gone to this conference. And unlike a lot of teens who come back from this conference super invigorated by their faith, similar to me, he became angry and withdrawn, and he eventually just refused to go to church. So I don't know who that young man is. I hope that he's okay, but you know, it was validating to hear that there were other people who experienced something negative there, because all anyone wants to talk about is the positive effects.
yeah. Well, I mean, that's all anyone really cares to hear about, especially when you're talking about a cherished thing. And to a lot of people, religion is precisely that, you know. So, yeah, nobody wants to hear the bad things. And unfortunately, I occasionally have a couple of trolls that come onto my channel that are tradcaths. I'm sure you've come across them on Twitter or someplace like that.
I'm not even sure. I have done my best to just avoid.
Yeah. But I mean, I wouldn't be at all surprised if these people came in and were like, oh, her faith's just lacking and
shit
like that. But by the sound of it, I mean, just by expressing a desire to go to this conference, that can't possibly have been true.
No. And I still stayed a super active member of the church for several years after this point. And, you know, if we collab again, I'd love to tell you all about some of those things. But I had stayed because I truly believed in God and in you know, the devil was out to get me, so I must be an evil person. I must, you know, work through the church to right these wrongs within me, even though I had no idea what they could possibly be. I was like, clearly there's something the devil sees in me. And I stayed, and I was super faithful. And, you know, it took years and years of other things going on until finally I was like, I can't do this to myself anymore. Like, and I'm super grateful that I have very understanding parents who I, at the time, only told them of sort of the latest events at the time that caused me to finally be like, I'm done. And they were super respectful of that. And, you know, even to this day, especially after hearing more and more information, they've been so understanding. And I know that doesn't happen for a lot of people who go through this sort of thing.
Yeah. You mentioned that you see a therapist. I'm not going to ask anything you discuss with your therapist. Obviously, that's way over the line. But would you say that this Steubenville youth event was a big cause of you needing to see one?
It's definitely something that had contributed to why I eventually went into therapy. And it's definitely been something that I have discussed with my previous therapist. It is something that I recently, unfortunately, had to get a new therapist because my old one was retiring. So I still need to inform her about all of this stuff, but I'll just send her a link to this video. That'll work. And talking about how that affects even if it's not just the events that I can feel and that I see coming back, especially after forcing myself to talk about it and remember it, I still held on to the mindsets that had developed in me from this sort of event, which was that everything and anything I do is evil and selfish unless it is totally beneficial to somebody else. Which led to a mindset that then, because of how I acted with that mindset, I ended up needing therapy.
Would you say the therapy's helped?
It's definitely helped a lot. I definitely, it's definitely relieving, although there are bad days. And, you know, especially since I do have many medical issues, the effects of having such a traumatic first asthma attack and then how these youth group members had treated me when other issues came up. It's definitely something where, like, now I have trouble accepting that I need help and accepting that it is okay for me to take medication as some of that help, because they made it feel like my medical care was something that would be detrimental to someone else. And in that case, it was me getting treatment would negatively impact my family. And so it's always going to be a work in progress, but I'm glad to be here and trying rather than just letting myself completely wither away, which is what I would have done, I think, if I had stayed. So.
Well, I'm definitely sorry that you had to go through so many traumas all in a row over the course of 3 days. That's
not even quite 3 days, because we had, oh gosh, so we had arrived at the place in New York where we had to start the journey at 6 a.m. And then our buses were running late, and so they refused to stop for us to get food. And we got there, we put our stuff in the dorms where we would be staying, and then we went immediately to that concert. And then we left by, I want to say it was like 9-10 o'clock on Sunday. So not quite entirely 3 days, but certainly like adding in recovery times, it felt like forever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the very least, I'm glad that you got the mental health help that you clearly needed after all that trauma.
Oh yeah.
People need to actually take their own mental health into account. It's very important.
Oh yeah.
Especially if you experience trauma.
Yeah.
So
get help, kids.
Get the words right out of my mouth.
But yeah, no. And I mean, how many people can say that they've had an exorcism?
I actually know a guy.
Perfect.
Yeah. Bible Belt Atheist. He and I are racing to 500 subscribers.
Oh.
Yeah.
Good luck.
He had an exorcism performed on him.
Oh.
Yeah. He actually made a video about it. I'll link it in the description if anyone's curious.
Oh, that'd be great.
But yeah, thanks for coming on to my channel and telling your story. I really appreciated it.
Absolutely.
All right. I appreciate it.